Okay, so I'm super excited about this episode. I had just finished recording my episode for Candace's show that she did yesterday, and I saw this pop up on my algorithm in YouTube, and I was shocked. So I knew that Alex Jones had teased this collab, but I wasn't sure when exactly it was going to be published or released on YouTube. So I saw it, I freaked out, and I could not wait to watch this interview and do this episode talking about all of the stuff that they discussed in this collab. Now, let's get into the general vibes of this collab. So, I'm really glad that this interview happened. We had a lot of build-up leading to this moment. We had this beef with Candace, the beef with Candace and Tucker. Charlie Kirk got roped into it. Charlie Kirk's assassination happened. And I think that a lot of people are now kind of having these collabs and sitting down to discuss their disagreements and their differences because they see potentially what the outcome could be when you hate people and you don't wish them well and you're not willing to have a conversation, you're resorting to violence. So I think it makes perfect sense that they are now sitting down together. Now, I'm sure Alex Jones is upset that he couldn't moderate this. He was really excited when he had Nick Fuentes on his show to talk about setting all of this up, but I'm sure he gets some sort of credit for putting this collab together. Now, because I've seen recent interviews where Nick Fuentes has gone on other people's platforms, he does talk about his backstory quite a bit, so I'm kind of tired of hearing about it, and so I kind of wish that they didn't spend so much time on this, and I think that this kind of speaks to one, maybe you just want to loop in a new audience of his people who have not heard his story, but I imagine on the different platforms that he's been on, there's going to be some overlap in the audience, so a lot of them are not going to be hearing this for the first time, I hope. But anyway, I thought they spent too much time on it, and I was also surprised that Tucker Carlson didn't know some of the details, and so he asked him a lot, like, hey, you know, this really happened? Are you sure? Like, you have proof? And all of that stuff, and there's nothing wrong with him asking those questions, but it's like it's 5 years, 10 years too late to kind of ask, like, if he has proof. Like, by now, I'm sure he knows what happened and all of that stuff, right? And so it just kind of caught me off guard a little bit that Tucker didn't already know that information, so that they did not have to spend as much time talking about it. And also, I felt that Nick Fuentes seemed a little bit frustrated at times, and you could see it where Tucker Carlson would say something, Nick obviously didn't agree, and so he would push back or he would maintain his stance, and that was good because that allows that debate aspect to come in, because I did mention in other interviews where I felt like people were kind of big brothering Nick or giving him advice or kind of indirectly trying to tell him how to act when he's interacting with other people. So I'm glad that there are opportunities for him to push back and hold his ground a little bit more, and I thought that he did that in this interview. And when it comes to Tucker Carlson's dad being in the CIA and Candace and Tucker and how he said, you guys are not, as far as disaffected white young men in America and basically them just bashing the people who they're supposed to be appealing to, they didn't really touch on that a whole lot, which I was kind of disappointed by. But Tucker did acknowledge, like, hey, you know, you're a good talker, because a lot of people were, like, fangirling over those 2 episodes that Nick had where he kind of just went after Tucker and revealed all of this information in the backstory. And so they said that he did a great job narrating those episodes and just laying everything out. Because if you've never seen one of Nick's episodes, he talks for a long time and it's, like, fluid and non-stop. And it's like, wow, like, just being able to hear someone talk like that. And yeah, so I'll just leave it at that. If you haven't seen a full episode, you can check those out on Rumble. Okay, so now let's get into some of the backstory. They did address kind of like the whole Joe Kent of it all, and that is kind of where the beef between Tucker and Nick Fuentes started, and so we can play a clip on that.
Convinced you were a Fed because I was like, here he's bear hugging like the one sincere guy who lost his wife in Syria thanks to the fucking crazy wars, neocon wars, and he's discredited. He's doing the David Duke. Like David Duke would always, every time I rolled out a new show, he would issue an endorsement of the show. I've never met the guy. What's that? Well, it's the feds. Obviously, he's trying to destroy me by association. Whatever. You see the point?
Yeah, but so let me ask you this. So if I'm supporting Joe Kent, I'm David Duke bear hugging. if I attack Joe Kent, I'm attacking the only sincere America First voices.
I get it. I mean,
So right now, Tucker is basically explaining why he said that Nick Fuentes was a Fed, and then he's also bringing up those comparisons that he made earlier to David Duke, and basically saying that by being associated with David Duke, that made him look bad, and he wasn't asking for those endorsements. If you're familiar with Nick Fuentes' story, he basically says that Joe Kent was the one who went after him first, and he just retaliated to send a message like, hey, there are consequences when you disavow me, basically.
You get it, and I just want to say I love Joe Kent. I can't, having been denounced by a lot of people I know what that feels like.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely am sympathetic to that.
Yeah.
I was denounced by someone like last night. I hurt my feelings. You know what I mean?
Okay, so that's the end of the clip. There's something else that I want to respond to that was in the first half. And basically, I like that Nick Fuentes held his feet to the fire here. And he said, basically, if I acknowledge him, that's bad because he has my acknowledgement. But if I crush him or go after him, that's bad because I'm crushing him. And so basically, it's just he can't win type of scenario where regardless of what he does, people are going to perceive it to be a bad thing if Nick supports you or if he's trashing you. And so I like that he basically said that and made Tucker kind of respond to that, and then Tucker did say, hey, I don't like it when people denounce me. And I thought that was interesting because there was one point in the interview where Tucker Carlson was basically like, hey, who cares if people talk about you, so what, and blah blah blah. And so he was kind of downplaying the way someone would feel about being personally attacked or being attacked publicly as far as what views you have. I think it's good that he is pushing back here and saying, hey, you can't have it both ways. And the other things that they talked about, just to give a quick rundown, they talked about his fallout with the Daily Wire, with Ben Shapiro over his questioning of why we give Israel $3.8 billion a year. He talked about being blacklisted, being put on the no-fly list, and then he also talked about being independent. And I thought that this was interesting because obviously Tucker is really trying to get him to explain what his journey is, but the way that he started the question made it seem like he didn't know what it was like to be independent or how someone independently started their own show. And that makes sense because he was at Fox News, he has a YouTube show, and it's not like he's doing this on his own, so he would not know what that's like for someone to really start from the bottom and have to do everything themselves. So we can play that clip.
And then where does that leave you? How did you succeed?
Well, I continued doing my show. I did it independently.
What does that mean? How do you do it? How do you do a show independently? How did you do it?
I started a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And I was in my parents' basement, and I put up a green screen.
I want to pause it here because him mentioning the basement is a reference to the beef that they had earlier because Candace and Tucker, they basically criticized him for being a gay kid in his parents' basement and all of that stuff. And so, yes, he actually does do stuff in his basement, and that's not a bad thing.
I got my computer, webcam, and I just started going live every night in the same way that I did at RSBN. I just did it on my own channel where I had creative control over it. And at that point, I basically mounted an attack on the conservative establishment from the outside. I sort of realized that there's sort of two ways you could play this. You could infiltrate the conservative movement. I could recant all my views and apologize and pretend to be one of them and bypass the gatekeepers, the censors. I said, or I could kind of be in the wilderness and I would be alone and I would be radioactive, but I could challenge the credibility and legitimacy of the conservative movement and its claim to represent conservatives. And that was
So all of that was very interesting. I really loved how he talked about what it was like to start his own channel on his own using a green screen. And if you've seen his older clips on Rumble, you can see he's using a green screen and it looks very different. I don't know if he's using a green screen right now. I like his setup that he has now. And so you can just see the progress that he's made and where he's come from, what he started with. And obviously he's still doing his own show and all of that, but he's obviously is a lot more successful now. And so it's just interesting to hear him talk about what it was like when he was first starting out, how he was handling his own show, and then also talking about having creative control over what he was doing. Because a lot of people, if you're talking about having handlers, you can't say whatever you want. You're restricted in some ways by the contract that you have, the people that you work for, and all of that stuff. So there's a lot of people who are commentators now who are not truly independent, where they are funding everything and they don't really answer to somebody else. Okay, so next I want to talk about the Trump story, and so this is where he's talking about the sit down that he had with Trump and Kanye West, and basically Kanye wanted to run for president and have Trump, I think, as his VP, and so they sat together for a Thanksgiving dinner, and he was just talking about how it was kind of awkward because Kanye was really shy and wouldn't talk, and then at some point him and Trump are having a conversation, and they are talking about, I guess, politics, and so I'll let that clip play.
Give you advice or correct you. And he said, no, don't be bashful. Tell me. And the story that I brought up was, this was really what sent me. In the first Fox News debate in 2015, in the Republican primary,
Yes.
Bret Baier, the first question said, raise your hand if you will not pledge to support the eventual nominee.
Yes.
And Trump raised his hand.
So I want to pause it there because I like that he started this clip by saying, hey, it's not my place to tell you how to run your business, basically, or what you should do politically. So there's a respect there to where he's understanding that this is someone who has accomplished more than he had, and this is someone that he respects, and so he's going to handle the conversation a certain way. And so that reminded me of the episode that I did on the Den of Kings, and basically NLE was annoying everybody, and then he was asked, like, hey, do you think that you're in a position to give other people advice? And obviously it was a rhetorical question. They wanted him to be like, oh, my bad, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be giving you guys advice. And he was like, I can only give advice if you're willing to receive it, basically. And so you can see how these are two young guys, because NLE is like 22 and Nick is like 26, 27, and you can see how they are handling these conversations differently, where Nick is showing that respect and saying, hey, I have some opinions, but obviously I'm going to hold my tongue out of respect for you and your position and all of that stuff.
Because that's what he was saying. He said, if I don't win, I'll run independent and I'll make Republicans lose. And so I brought that up and I told that story, and I said, I feel like what was inspiring in 2016 is that you were willing to let the Republican establishment lose. Like, you were serious about blowing them up.
I want to pause it here because this is really important, because he's basically talking about how when Trump was first running for president, he was not willing to endorse somebody else if he were to lose the race. And that's something that you usually see. Like, I think RFK Jr. was running and then he turned around and endorsed Trump, and his family was upset about him doing that. And so what he's saying here is that Trump said that he would not do that. Like, he's basically in it to win it, and he is not going to turn around and endorse or support someone else. It's either him or nobody's going to win, basically. What I'm trying to say is that he is betting on himself. He's not betting on other people to win. And you can kind of see how Nick would like this, because earlier on, where basically why he was going after the conservatives is because he wanted to basically force the conservatives to come to where he was. He wasn't going to budge on his opinions and his takes and all of that stuff, right? And so he was saying, you're either going to be with me and we're going to take over the conservative movement and we're going to basically do things our way, or we're not going to do it anyway at all, basically, right? And so you can see why he would relate to what Trump was saying in that moment, because that's the approach that he has taken as far as working from the outside to kind of not necessarily infiltrate the conservative movement, but really force it to operate and think differently than it currently does.
Such that you are not going to say, like Pat Buchanan, who I respect, but Sam Francis acknowledged that was one of his great mistakes, was ultimately endorsing Bush. I said, it showed you were serious, you were playing to win, because you said, I will let this Republican Party crash and burn. I want to run as the Republican, but if I can't, I'll run independent. I said, and that's how I knew you were serious. And that's how I knew you were the guy.
So that's just very interesting when you think of it like that, and what people are drawn to and kind of how they operate and how they try to achieve the agenda. Are they really focused on what they want to do and they're in it to win it? Or are they just kind of in it until someone else can take over and all of that stuff? And so I find that interesting, but I'm not surprised that that is something that he was drawn to, or something that would have kind of stuck with him when it comes to Trump. And it's also really nice to hear him talk about his heroes because, yes, he does go after people a lot or call them out at least, but you don't really hear him enough, I think, talk about the people that he respects and his heroes, because he was saying at one point, because we all know that he went after Tucker, but he was saying, like, you know, I've said good things about you on my show and all of that stuff, and so you hear more of the bad than the good, and so it's just nice to hear him talk about how he was happy and excited to be sitting down with two of his heroes. And obviously that conversation didn't go well, but that is going to be a good memory for him. Just the fact that he was able to sit at that table as young as he is and have a conversation and hold his own with these two different men who are from completely different walks of life, with Kanye being a rapper, being black, being a musician, all of that stuff, and Trump being a builder, being a president, and all of that stuff as well. Now, the next clip I want to play is super interesting, and this is where I think it reveals that Tucker didn't really know enough about Nick Fuentes going into this interview. And so basically, they are talking about different topics, and you can kind of see that Tucker is kind of going off on a tangent into something a little bit different than what Nick is necessarily talking about. And so there's a point where Nick is just like, hey, you know, what is it about my views that you don't agree with, basically? And we can play the clip and see how that turns out.
What about my views do you think are unreasonable, if yours are reasonable?
I think, again, I don't think it's cucky. I think it's reality to say that guilt is not inherited. Blood guilt is bad. One of the reasons that I'm mad about Gaza is because the Israeli position is everyone who lives in Gaza is a terrorist because of how they were born, including the women and the children. That's not a Western view. That's an Eastern view. That's a
I want to pause it here because I find this interesting, because his answer to this question that Nick is asking is blood guilt. And so I don't know if that's the first thing that people think of when they think of Nick Fuentes. They may think of him as being a racist or a misogynist and all of that stuff, right? And so this is an interesting answer. It's very specific because he gives the example of the people in Gaza and thinking that they're all terrorists just because some of them are. And I can understand what he's saying there. But when I think of views that people would disagree with, people wouldn't say blood guilt as their answer, right? They would give a more everyday speech type of answer that people could understand. And so I think that he is basically kind of answering this question from what he thinks he knows about Nick Fuentes, because Nick is going to kind of respond to that in a second. But I think that this just shows that he didn't really know enough about Nick's views to actually answer this question appropriately.
Unchristian, that's totally incompatible with Christianity and Western civilization. They say, oh, we're the defenders of Western civilization. Not with that attitude. You're not. Collective punishment is the enemy of Western civilization.
Yeah.
And so I hate that attitude. It's genocidal. The current claims that I'm a cancer, you know, from Ben Shapiro or whatever, we need to be excised from the body of conservatism, is a genocidal position that it basically encourages violence, as they well know. The whole thing I hate. Mm-hmm. So like anytime you say a whole group of people is responsible for the sins of some of its members, like I'm out.
Yeah, but that's not my view.
It's not. Okay.
I think that this is interesting because, again, he's talking about collective punishment. And I can understand when he says collective punishment or something like that, because Nick has made comments about the black community specifically. He talked about the crime rates and stats and all of that stuff and saying like, hey, you know, black people are violent, you need to stay away from black people, basically. And so in that sense, this is starting to make more sense, his answer. But what he started with didn't quite make sense to me. But as he continued to explain, it did. But I also think that this still doesn't quite capture what Nick Fuentes is all about and what his views are.
So tell me your views. Like, rather than, you're one of those people, one of the reasons I wanted to meet you is you're one of those people who is defined by clips.
Yes.
And I'm one of those people also.
Yes.
Right? So I get it. So I'm going to just shut up and you tell me what you actually believe.
Yeah. Well, and listen, I mean, and I appreciate you saying that, because that's just the reality of the media environment we're in. So I don't expect you to know all my views, but I mean.
So that was a really nice response from Nick. He could have kind of gone in a little bit more, but he did enough to call him out and say like, hey, you know, those aren't my views, whatever. And then Tucker adjusted and said, oh, okay, well, what are your views? And then he kind of met him halfway and said, hey, you know, I don't expect you to know all of my views and all of that stuff. And then, you know, we're defined by clips and all of that stuff. And so you can see him trying to kind of bridge the gap here without necessarily going nuclear and saying like, hey, you don't know enough about me, or going off on him the way that he did with Candace when she was giving him that marriage advice and all of that stuff, right? And so you can see here that Tucker didn't have enough knowledge to answer this question and actually say like why people don't like Nick Fuentes for his views and all of that stuff. And so I think they handled this part well, and I'm glad that Nick did say like, hey, you know, those aren't my views, or you're not accurately reflecting what I think my views are, right? And so this was definitely an interesting part of the conversation. Okay, moving on, they talked about porn, and I thought it was really wild how casually they were discussing this topic, but obviously they weren't being graphic or anything like that, but they were more so talking about the implications that this has on young men and women who engage in this behavior. So I do think that it was good that they were taking the conversation in that direction, and it's really nice because you have Nick Fuentes, who is a younger guy who is in his prime, so to speak, and you expect young men to behave in certain ways when it comes to women, and obviously we know that he is celibate, he's waiting for marriage, and so his take on this is going to be very different from like the average guy. And then we have Tucker Carlson, who's married with kids, and he's much older, so he's going to have a very different perspective on interacting with women as men.
Phone, every kid has an iPad, and every iPad and phone is, if you know what it is, loaded up with porn. And it's infinite, and it's ubiquitous, and you can get every kind of it you want, whenever you want. It's in your pocket. And so something that is almost never talked about is that this is a generation that's totally sexually dysfunctional, I think, because of pornography.
I think that this is interesting that he's saying this because a lot of people think in general, this Generation Z basically, and maybe millennials too, but basically they're chronically online. So just the access that they have to the internet, the constant access, that impacts them as well. But on top of that, the access to porn and all of that stuff also has an impact, and it's making them more antisocial, making them spend more time on their devices versus with real people, and that distorts their relationships and their view of reality.
And some people are able to cope with it. Some people don't have a problem. But I think a lot of people, and maybe even a small minority, have a serious problem with it. And
How does it make people sexually dysfunctional?
I think that it's impossible for a real woman to compete with the availability and the novelty of pornography.
I think it's really good that he's making this point because that's the argument that women have been making for a long time. It's not a realistic portrayal of women and how they perform in the bedroom and what that relationship is like. And so it's good to have a man saying this, especially a young man who has chosen not to have sex or participate in sexual activity until he's married. So he's doing that for a religious reason, a honorable reason, and all of that stuff, right? And so that's not something that you hear people talk about until it's too late or until they've suffered the negative effects of that. And so more so you hear people either trying to prevent it and people don't listen to them, or you hear people who have dealt with it and are dealing with the consequences and they're trying to warn other people about it.
A real woman, like without getting graphic, she's only one person, and maybe she wants to do something sexual, maybe she doesn't. Porn is, you could have 100 different women in one sitting doing anything, that whatever niche or idiosyncratic thing a person might be into, it's there. And so I think that novelty combined with that availability, it makes it so that, when you think about courting a woman, juice isn't worth the squeeze.
This is a really good comment because people have traditionally always said that it's like, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? And so this is no different from that. And it's talking about how basically women are engaging in behaviors before marriage, but this is also a little bit different because it's an extension of behaviors that you can engage in without actually interacting with people or women, men in real life when it comes to this very personal experience, and he's talking about how this impacts relationships. And I do think it's interesting because I'm not sure how people see it, because some people see it as a way to kind of like not bug your wife, or other people see it as cheating and all of that stuff. And so it's a very interesting conversation for sure.
And so there's like also a problem of like erectile dysfunction, people that can't enjoy regular sex because it does not compare to the intensity, the novelty, and the availability of porn. It's hyper stimulation. And so I think that's sabotaging a lot of normal sexual relationships.
It seems like it's making a lot of people gay too.
Yeah. And
Okay, so that's the end of a clip. What I found interesting was that he was talking about overstimulation or hyperstimulation, and basically it's almost like he's talking about an addiction, because he was talking about how like you do something and then you just have to do more of it to get that same high. And so that's what he's saying is leading people into doing more kind of like extreme and crazy acts and whatever, just to get that initial high that they were feeling. And so that is interesting because people don't think about like internet addiction. People do think about sex addiction and all of that stuff, but they don't think about what people in a general sense who are just trying to feel something and doing more and more to get that same feeling, and what that leads you to when you have to keep doing more extreme stuff. And so that is super interesting. Now, moving on, they talk about OnlyFans, and this was pretty interesting. He did make a comment about Linktree, which I found kind of funny, because when you think about how casual Linktree is and all of that stuff, it just makes his comment more funny. So we can watch that.
people don't even recognize that OnlyFans is a whole separate category. It's an innovation in the realm of pornography, because you have what everyone knows as porn, which is like videos of porn stars, like dedicated career sex workers having sex in a relatively controlled environment or something like that.
I want to pause it here because, again, that is how people traditionally think of porn. And so people don't think about seeing porn when they're looking at Instagram, TikTok, and all of that stuff. Like, you recognize that there's half-naked people, or there's people being very suggestive on those platforms, but you don't think of it as being the same as old-school traditional porn because it looks very different.
But then you get OnlyFans, which is like Patreon for nudes or sex. And basically, there's now a very large subculture, much larger than people want to admit, of women who the moment they turn 18, that is what they do, is they make an OnlyFans account and they become an amateur porn star. And it is complete.
I think that is important to recognize, because I know two high-profile situations of that happening. The first one I think is Bad Baby or Bad Barbie, whatever her name is. That's the girl who says "Catch Me Outside." And then Little Tay recently was one of like the most recent 18-year-olds or whatever to join OnlyFans. And then I think there was another girl who also joined OnlyFans, and she made like $1 million in like a day or something like that. And so you can see that there's like a market for that, and it can be a good thing or a bad thing. Like, obviously if you're selling nudes and all of that stuff, and that's bad, but you have the choice to do that, whatever. But then also there is a industry of people who are on OnlyFans who aren't doing that type of work, and so that is important to acknowledge. But traditionally OnlyFans has been associated with sex work.
Casual, because you could say that maybe 10 years ago, even at the heyday of internet porn, to be in porn, you got to be a porn star. Like, that's your life and that's your career and that's who you are, and it's very shameful. With OnlyFans, it's like having a TikTok. It's like, here's my Linktree, here's my Instagram account, here's my Facebook account, here's my YouTube, and here's my OnlyFans.
Why would any of this be legal?
So I thought that Tucker's response at the end there was interesting. And so he is obviously listening to Nick Fuentes, but he's not directly responding to what he says before kind of like transitioning into his point. And so I thought that was kind of like an awkward transition, even though it's a very valid question, because I think what they lead into is like human trafficking and all of that stuff. And so the point that they're talking about here is how the porn industry, it used to be something that was kind of like far off in a random corner somewhere where it was a sin, or it was taboo to look at and engage with, but now it's kind of everywhere to where it's destigmatized and you don't realize that it's happening when you see a half-naked person constantly in front of you on social media. And so just how casual sexual intimacy has become, especially when you think about hookup culture and all of this stuff. And so there's different avenues and different ways to where sexual intimacy is being treated as casually as picking up a phone to text somebody, whereas it used to mean something very different. And when you're constantly on the internet and on social media, you don't really think of how kind of that transition has happened to where you think that sex is so casual because you're not really understanding what has happened. It just kind of feels like in a blink of an eye or in a snap or something like that, sex has become kind of like meaningless in a sense. Moving on, they talked about marriage, and so I was really happy to see Nick having this conversation with an older man because he did have a stream with Myron Gaines and Andrew Tate, and I thought that Andrew Tate would kind of check him a little bit on the stuff that he was saying about women, because he was basically talking about women the way a brother talks about his sister. He thinks women are super annoying, that sort of thing, and that's not how most men think of women. They may think some women are annoying when they think of their spouse or their wife or whatever. They kind of hold them in a higher regard than they were doing in that live stream. And so I'm really happy that Tucker had a completely different approach and he pushed back on some of the things that Nick Fuentes was saying, because I don't think other men have quite done that.
Country and half the dishes and things like that. And it's like, so what do you do all day? You're on TikTok, you're like doom scrolling and eating Cheetos. Like what actually are you providing in the relationship? So I just feel like in terms of the deficit, it's like women are very emboldened. They're too, I think, assertive, always giving their opinions, always critiquing, always, I think that they're very bold right now. And I
want to pause it here because this is an interesting take, because I think women are always going to be bold and have an opinion. That's just something that you have to deal with. But I can understand that some people might be annoyed with it, because like when Candace was telling him all of that stuff, he was like, he didn't appreciate having a woman wagging her finger in his face and all of that stuff. And so when you hear him talk about it, sometimes it's a little bit funny, but I also think that it's unrealistic to expect that women are never going to have an opinion, or they're only going to speak or have an opinion when it's appropriate and all of that stuff. And so I don't think you're going to be able to get away from that.
And sarcastic. I think that's a big reason why they're not very attractive.
I get it. All I would say is that in a happy marriage, all of that goes away. There's no arguing about who does what. People fall seamlessly into the roles they were born into. They acknowledge those. They're not insecure about it at all. They express love in a whole bunch of different ways by serving each other. It's like super easy. And all of that, obnoxious, entitled, you don't make enough money, all that crap just disappears. Anyway, that's been my experience. So last question,
So I thought that was a really good answer from Tucker, because again, from the interviews that I've seen, other men have not really kind of taken this approach with Nick when it comes to women. And I think that really only came up in the Myron Gaines Andrew conversation. I know, but there's other clips, because there's one viral clip where he's talking about having not been with a woman in that way. He's interviewing with a woman and she's like, well, how do you know women are annoying if you haven't been around them or you haven't had an experience with them? And she's talking about a sexual experience, but he's like, well, I'm having one right now, right? And so he's just talking about interacting with women in a casual sense and how that's turning him off. But I think that it's really good that an older man who's married, who has kids, and sees like the value in that relationship is able to make a comment like this, and hopefully that lands, because I really do think that Nick's opinion of women being annoying and all of that stuff will change when he gets to that stage where he's like, okay, I want to be a husband and there's a woman out there who's going to be my wife, and that relationship is going to look much different than whatever he said on that stream with Myron Gaines and Andrew Tate and all of that stuff. And so I like that Tucker took this approach. Okay, so let's also hear more of what Nick was saying as far as women being too liberal.
So what are the other factors that prevent, I'm sorry I called you gay, by the way, but I'm always, I think I'm just too old or something. I'm like, why is anyone married? You tell me, why aren't people married?
Well, I mean, honestly, it's the women. The women are extremely liberal. No one talks about that. Increasingly they do, especially after the last election. There's a 45-point difference between men and women. The men are extremely conservative, increasingly. The women are extremely liberal.
What are they liberal on? What issues? Like, what does that mean, liberal?
Oh, they're very feminist.
Like, actually?
Extremely feminist, yes.
I think it's funny how Tucker doesn't believe that women are like really feminist, and obviously he's married and he doesn't have to deal with women in that way. But I do think it's interesting that people are saying that women are too liberal. I don't know if it means that women have too much freedom. I don't think it means that at all, but it also means that with the equality and the freedom to do everything that men can do, women aren't embracing the things that make them a woman and make them different from men. Women aren't still embracing that. They're embracing behaviors that make them more like men. And the point was so that you had equality, so that if you wanted to work, you would be able to work and get paid the same and all of that stuff and be treated as an equal. But it didn't necessarily mean that you had to kind of destroy that natural balance that exists between men and women. It just meant that on paper, you guys are equals and you're not like a second class citizen in America, in the world in general, right?
Believe that, do they?
I think they do.
Really?
Absolutely,
How could
yes.
you believe that?
I
If
think
gender roles are a construct, that none of this is inborn, like, you'd have to be an idiot to think that.
they like the idea of it. They like because of course I think all women naturally want strong men.
Of course, obviously.
They naturally want a Chad. You know,
Yeah.
they want like a tall, buff guy. But I think they like the idea of none of them want to work either. None of them
That's what I'm
actually want
saying.
to work.
No, that's what
but-
I'm saying. Of course. That's of course.
Right.
It's obviously true. It's always been true.
So I'm going to push back on that because I do think women want to work, and sometimes women want to work at the expense of having a family because they think they can do it all. They think they can have a family later in life, and then they realize like, hey, it's not going to work out that way. So I do think that women do want to work. They do have something that they're passionate about, but then eventually they realize that there's a different type of work involved when it comes with raising a family and having a marriage and all of that stuff, and that might be more enjoyable than actually having a corporate job or whatever type of job that you have that doesn't directly contribute to raising a family or being married, if that makes sense.
Work outside the home.
Right.
They don't have enough work at home. There's
Yes.
a lot to do. But no, I completely agree. So that's why I question, like, they're feminists in what sense?
Yes. And, they like these vague appeals to equality. We want a chance to work and we want respect. And, ultimately, I think the whole political system is just based around women never being accountable for any of their choices. Ultimately, that seems to be that's what abortion is.
Yeah, of course.
Because 99% of abortions are elective. So they say it's an unplanned pregnancy. You had sex out of wedlock with someone you didn't intend to have kids with. So now we have to kill the kids in the womb. And, these no-fault divorce laws.
I want to pause it there because that's super interesting. I know that people are probably going to take issue with that because, again, you're blaming the woman for what happened, but the man participated too. And so both people are guilty of that. The man can just abstain from sex or not be involved with that woman if he doesn't want to have kids with that woman. And so I think it goes both ways. The responsibility is on both people. And as I talk about later, he was saying that the men have the responsibility. They have the authority, but for whatever reason, they're not kind of like embracing that or enacting that. And so men have a large responsibility for the way that relationships are between men and women because they've allowed all of this behavior, basically.
These women get married to guys maybe they never intend to stay with. And then when they're out, they're done. And they want child support and they want half the stuff. And I think a lot of men are looking at women and they're very liberal. They're overweight. They have a very high estimation of themselves. I think that people call it hoflation.
Hoflation?
Yes, they're...
I have to pause right here because I saw a funny comment about this because it's just, again, funny to have two white guys talking about hoflation, which is not necessarily something that you associate with middle-class America. That's more like urban America or whatever. And so I just find it funny that he's educating him on hoflation because I've heard Candace talk about that as well. And there's some weird, funny phrase that she says about the hose and whatever. And so it's just really funny. And if I can find that comment that someone posted on YouTube, because it was just really funny to see them talking about hoflation because that's not like a casual conversation that you talk about or that you discuss.
Their sense of their own looks and sexual value is very inflated. And so a lot of people are looking at these like frumpy, obnoxious, loudmouth, liberal women who are also very promiscuous and saying this is not actually appealing at all. And I don't want to start a family with a person
Sounds
like
awful.
this. Yeah, it is.
But if you believe in the patriarchy, as I fervently do, because it's just reality, we didn't choose the system. We were born into a system that is part of nature, can't get out of it. So if you believe.
So I thought that was a very interesting take. Like, we're all born into the system and nobody really has control. And obviously men have the power and they did control things for a while. But I also think that is also biology and what naturally should happen, that men are more powerful or whatever, but they're also supposed to submit and kind of cater to women and kind of restore the balance that way. But I also found it interesting that he was talking about women being overweight, frumpy, and promiscuous and all of that stuff. It's just interesting to see how women are being judged when it comes to society and interactions with men, because I think the overweight thing is probably something that people may push back on, because different cultures like women of different sizes, and so being overweight may not be an issue. Being frumpy and how you dress and all of that stuff, that could definitely be an issue. And then being promiscuous, I don't think most men like it when women are promiscuous, but they also may not ask about your body count or something like that. But I know that all of those things matter in some way or another. And then Tucker also goes on to say that he doesn't know a happily married woman who is a liberal, which I found super interesting. That just goes back to the natural dynamic between men and women. So the man is responsible for protecting the house, and then the woman kind of run things in the house, like making sure you have dinner, making sure the kids are fed and have clothes and all of that stuff, and just making sure that the schoolwork is done. And then the father kind of helps out with that. So it's not like the woman's just responsible for everything in the house and it's just her responsibility. It really should be a partnership where they kind of pick up each other's slack when it's needed while still respecting their different roles. And you don't always see that. Sometimes you see the man come home, he doesn't want to be bothered with the family because he worked all day and all of that stuff, and that's not a real partnership when you just leave it to one person to do everything. And even if it is your responsibility, you should help out in the ways that you can, even if it's not your area. And then Nick also talks about how he hates when men say, or when women say, hey, I married my best friend. He's really pushing back on this idea that men and women are equal in relationships, and he talks about how women are the helper to men. And I think that this is a good take, but it's also a very different way to explain it, because he has made the same point, but he's made it in a more kind of rude and dismissive way, to where it kind of just makes the woman feel like she's like a slave or something like that, or she's not respected in the household. Whereas here he made it really seem more like a collaborative effort between a man and his wife to kind of have conversations, talk things out, while the man has the final say and how things are run and all of that stuff. And so before, he made it seem like the man just controls everything and it's his way or it's no way. And obviously that sounds like an abusive man, because it probably is, but he's is really more so able to better flesh out his ideas, and he's not communicating in the way that he normally does on his show, where he's being provocative and he's saying crazy things that people are going to kind of clip and make go viral. And so I like that he's able to kind of more fully flushed out his ideas and say, this is a collaboration. A man and his wife, they talk things out and then they make a decision. The husband makes a decision, that sort of thing, because it sounds like a more peaceful relationship between men and women than something that's really chaotic. Moving on, they talked about what the next 5 years looks like, and one thing that they talked about was basically politics and the relationships between the different political parties. They did talk about Charlie Kirk and basically how people reacted to his death and all of that stuff, and what that means in terms of getting along with people who don't agree with you. So I do want to play a clip on that.
And it wasn't just that he got shot, it was what happened afterward, which is that 100,000 liberals went on TikTok and celebrated. And that shows that how can you integrate or harmonize with people that hate you that much? They see some, and I understand that liberals thought he was a jerk. Like maybe he was a little rude.
I want to pause it here because that's super important, because again, he's talking about getting along with people who you don't agree with, people that you don't like, and then he's also going to touch on, because a lot of people have mixed opinions on whether or not Charlie was racist, he was sexist, and all of that stuff, and so he's going to give his take on what he thinks about how Charlie kind of generally engaged with people.
Or something like that. And he really wasn't. I mean, he was pretty patient as they come.
I just tried to fill in for him last week and immediately snapped at some kid and threatened to beat him up and went crazy. And and I had said a prayer for patience, by the way, and I still couldn't handle it. So, Charlie Kirk was a remarkably even-keeled, patient, decent man.
Yes. And yeah, so whatever their perception of him was.
So I think he's going to go on to say that whatever their perception of him was, he didn't deserve to be killed for it, because, again, he's just speaking and talking about his ideas. He's not advocating for violence and all of that stuff. And so it is really sad when you see that people have different opinions and they can't talk it out. And so it is really good that Tucker and Nick Fuentes were able to sit down and have this conversation, because I don't know if they would have if Charlie Kirk hadn't been assassinated, because you wouldn't have really had that kind of oh-ish moment where you really realize how bad things are and the direction that it's headed in. And so obviously, if you can, you want to turn things around and sit down and have conversations with people that you don't agree with or people that you are not aligned with, because you see what it could lead to. And then they also talked about just the general state of things in terms of immigration, because that was a big concern that Nick Fuentes had many years ago. And so he was talking about ICE and how basically people are preventing ICE from doing their job, whether it's citizens blocking cars, whether it's the mayor or the governor not letting whatever happen. And so he's basically saying that in order to prevent all of this, to send a strong message, you have to basically crush the left. And obviously he doesn't mean that in a violent way. He's just talking about preventing them from being able to control everything in a way that causes a lot of chaos. He's saying you need to send a strong message. You need to arrest people who are not going along with what they should be doing, which is allowing you guys to get controlled, allowing you to deport people who shouldn't be here and all of that stuff. And so I do have mixed feelings on immigration and how it's being handled, but I also think that there are people in politics, in the government, who allow this sort of thing to happen, and now we have to deal with what is happening as far as deporting people. How do we get them out of here if they don't belong here? How do we make sure that people can become legal citizens and all of that stuff? And so it's just an interesting, chaotic time now to deal with that immigration issue. And I really wish that people didn't allow it to get this bad to now we have to try to fix it, and we try to fix it in ways that don't really seem humane and ways that don't allow for dignity, because it is crazy to see these videos of people getting snatched up and all of that stuff, regardless of what they did and why they did it. There is a way that you go about arresting people. If you're trying to arrest people and then they're trying to flee and they shoot at you and all of that stuff, then I understand the craziness. But if they're just not doing anything and you go to arrest them and it still results in something chaotic happening, that's pretty crazy. And then I know that the protesters don't really make that easy as well, because they just increase and ramp up the tension and make something that is already a chaotic and stressful situation even more stressful. Alrighty, so that's the end of this video. That was everything that I wanted to cover. I'm really glad that Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson sat down together, and I really do want to point out that Nick is very different when he's interviewing with people, when he's doing collabs like this, because when he's on his show, he does his own thing. He is on a different level and a different energy, and when he's in interviews, he's more calm and he better gets his ideas across so that you can really understand where he's coming from, and then you can actually figure out whether or not you agree with him or you disagree with him based on like his calm explanation versus viral clips that are meant to kind of rage bait and get you kind of feeling one way and all of that stuff. And so I'm really glad that they had this conversation. I wish that they got into a little bit more of the different topics so that they could have a true debate and have Tucker push back and have Nick push back and all of that stuff. But overall, this was a pretty good interview, and I'm sure that people are going to be very excited that they sat down together and had this conversation. Alrighty, so let me know in the comment section what you think about this interview between Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson. Was there anything that you thought that they should have covered that they didn't? Did you like this interview? Let me know all of that good stuff in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.